Hello and welcome to Podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. When you're ready to launch your next app or want to try a project you hear about on the show, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so take a look at our friends over at Linode. With 200 gigabit private networking, scalable shared block storage, node balancers, and a 40 gigabit public network, all controlled by a brand new API, you've got everything you need to scale up. And for your tasks that need fast computation, such as training machine learning models, they just launched dedicated CPU instances. And they also have a new object storage service to make storing data for your apps even easier. Go to pythonpodcast.com/linode, that's Linode today to get a $20 credit and launch a new server in under a minute. And don't forget to thank them for their continued support of this show. And you listen to this show to learn and stay up to date with the ways that Python is being used, including the latest in machine learning and data analysis. For even more opportunities to meet, listen, and learn from your peers, you don't want to miss out on this year's conference season. We have partnered with organizations such as O'Reilly Media, Corinium Global Intelligence, ODSC, and Data Council. Upcoming events include the Software Architecture Conference, the Strata Data Conference, and PyCon US. Go to pythonpodcast.com/conferences to learn more about these and other events, and take advantage of our partner discounts to save money when you register today. Your host as usual is Tobias Macy, and today I'm interviewing Tal Einat about the IDLE editor for Python, its history, and what is in store for its future. So Tal, can you start by introducing yourself?
Yes, with pleasure. Hi, I'm Tal Einat. I'm from Israel. I've been programming with Python since 2001. I'm now a core developer since 2010 of the Python language. These days, I'm a partner and co-founder of the educational technology company Foolproof, which develops tools for studying high school math.
And do you remember how you first got introduced to Python?
Yeah, I learned Python and programming in a course that I did before my military service in Israel. In Israel, we have mandatory military service. When I served, it was mandatory 3 years. So we had an intense half-year course. We were taught a bunch of stuff. We were taught programming right from the basics, and we studied mostly C and Python. And we started with C, and I remember distinctly that when we first started learning Python, the first course, the first class with Python was just such a breath of fresh air. It was like love at first sight, and I've been loving using Python since then.
And so, as we mentioned at the opening, we're going to be talking about the IDLE module in Python. So for anybody who hasn't used it, can you just start by explaining a bit about what it is?
So IDLE is an IDE, hence the name. It's an integrated development environment. It's named as it is after Eric Idle, who was one of the 6 cast members of Monty Python, after which the language is named. So everything in Python is named after something Python related, Monty Python usually. So it's a simple IDE. It's supposed to be usable and used by mostly by beginning programmers, beginning Python programmers, and usually novice programmers in general. So its goal... it's different than most IDEs and purposefully so.
So as you mentioned, it's targeted mainly at beginners to the language or beginners to programming in general, and it's been part of the standard library of Python for quite a while now, and I'm curious if you happen to know the original motivation for adding it to the core of Python and some of the history behind it.
Yeah, so I actually asked Guido about this in preparation for this podcast, and what he told me is that back in 1998, he just thought he was looking at IDEs and specifically Visual Studio, which was ruling the Windows world of software development. And he said, well, it would be cool if we had something like that for Python, and then just started hacking on it. So Guido van Rossum, the original creator of Python, was also the original creator of IDLE. And this is after he mentioned that in 95, he also created a browser. So he had a previous history of creating things that he just thought would be cool and doing them with Python. So that was the original motivation. And it sort of grew from there. At some point, that was in 98. In 2000, there was a discussion with several developers some of who joined Guido working on IDLE, and they decided that they wanted to add a few major features and changes to IDLE, which they did in the form of creating a new project they called IDLE Fork, which they developed outside of the main repository of IDLE. for a couple of years. This was led by David Scher, along with Nicholas Riley and Peter Schneider Camp. So they worked on that. They added an RPC mechanism so that the Python commands themselves in the interactive shell would be run in a subprocess and keep the GUI responsive at all times, and a bunch of other things which we take for granted as being central features of IDLE came about in that project. And that was merged back into the core Python code base in 2002 when the project was, in 2003, when the IDLE fork project was completed.
Because of the fact that IDLE has been baked into the language for a while, it's often pointed to as sort of the first environment for people to start experimenting with writing Python or learning to program. And so I'm curious what you have seen as being some of the main use cases for IDLE and how the original motivation of building it and having it as part of the language has evolved along with the evolution of the computing environments that we have and just the overall capabilities of other editors or the ease of use of getting started with Python and text editing environment.
So I think when Guido started working on it, in the first few years of when IDLE was developed, it was seen as this would be the Python IDE, similarly to Visual Studio being used on Windows for developing the Microsoft languages. But I think that view changed when they started the IDLE fork project. They defined very clear aims and goals for the project. And some of those were keeping it simple, keeping it as a very simple and easy to use IDE. And in later stages, in 2002, Kurt B. Kaiser took over leading the project. And later, in the past few years, Terry J. Reedy has been leading it. And again, when this discussion has come up, we've always decided to keep those as the main goals. And I think that mirrors very well the main uses of IDLE. It's mostly used by when teaching Python, it's mostly used when teaching Python to new programmers or by new programmers learning Python or learning programming. Or sometimes it's used when you just need a very simple IDE without fully installing a heavy editor or IDE. And so I'd say having it baked in and almost always installed with Python enables the second form of use. When you just need a simple editor, you can always run IDLE. And the first type of use when used in learning Python is really helped by keeping it very simple and easy to use and geared towards new programmers rather than power users. So, for example, one of the core developers, a longtime core developer, Raymond Hedinger, who a lot of what he does these days is teaching Python development. Raymond uses IDLE in his teaching almost every day. And he's been using it for many years. He's been one of the developers and also giving us a lot of feedback on what happens when lots of people try to use IDLE to learn Python. And he's just one example. We get a lot of feedback from him, but I know that a lot of other people teaching Python have used IDLE over the years very often.
And because of the fact that it is simple to get started with, but also fairly simple in terms of its feature set, I'm wondering what you have found to be the sort of general limitations or the tipping point where people need to move beyond IDLE and into a different editor or a different IDE, and what IDLE has built in as far as being able to maybe stretch its use cases beyond the out-of-the-box experience.
So I think, one case when people move on from IDLE is when they were looking for more powerful editing abilities. For example, anyone who's a power user of an editor such as VI or Emacs or any major IDE such as Visual Studio or the newer ones like Sublime Text, VS Code, they know those have lots of powerful editing features that allow you to just work faster, make changes to code much faster. The IDLE is purposefully missing many of those features to keep the interface very simple and to keep what you need to learn to use it effectively to a small set of things to learn. But that also, it does definitely limit its usability for anyone who wants more advanced editing features. It also lacks integration of many other things like refactoring tools that more fully featured IDEs have tools for running tests automatically, tools for integrating with version control systems, and so on and so on. So I think in many professional environments, when people are developing professionally, usually they work in an organization or in a team, and they find themselves moving on to tools that are more widely used in their team or integrate better with the tool set used by that team. And the other side of IDLE that we haven't discussed so far, but I think is one of its major advantages, is for interactive work. And that's actually where so many IDEs don't focus, but IDLE has focused quite a bit. So IDLE's shell, its interactive environment, which used to just enter commands and see their run commands, see their output, is very, very useful. It's relatively powerful, even compared to alternatives. It's more comparable to interactive environments such as IPython or Jupyter. And so that is very usable and has some nice GUI features that are, for example, missing in IPython. And it's also its features are more easily discoverable thanks to the GUI compared to IPython, where you have to read more documentation or go through a tutorial. So I think for interactive use, I still use it almost daily for interactive things in Python, sometimes just for checking out what a certain function does, or getting seeing the help for a certain class. It's very quick to just fire up IDLE's shell and check it out there than to search through the docs. So I think that's sort of something that stands out in IDLE and makes it very usable, even for people who mostly use other environments for development.
And so I'm wondering if you can go through a bit more of the feature set that is built into IDLE so that people can maybe compare and contrast between the initial implementation that they might have from just typing IDLE at the command line and seeing a window pop up and then wonder, what am I supposed to do with this, versus people who are coming to Python from the experience of using some of these more full-featured or heavyweight IDEs, or even something like Emacs or VI, where it's just a native text environment and all the integrations are set up manually.
So IDLE is, first of all, a graphic application. It works, it's cross-platform, it's built on the TK. It's built on the TK graphical toolkit, which uses the TCL language underneath, and that's sort of, on a technical level, very interesting sort of integration. But what that allows it is to be very cross-platform. It works on Windows and Linux and Mac and so on. And being a GUI environment with a very advanced shell, but being simple enough that anyone can just start using it without learning almost anything, is, I think, a major benefit. And then IDLE's two major modes are, it has editor windows for editing files with code, usually with code, and then the shell window. The editor windows are relatively simple editors. They do have basic features such as search and replace, just anything you'd basically expect from an editor. It does have some auto completion, for example. It has a nice code context feature. So while you're scrolling, you can see the context of the code you're currently looking at. So it does have a few niceties. And one recent feature that has been asked for a long time that I've added is line numbers, which has been missing for many years. But other than that, as I mentioned before, it lacks features such as refactoring and anything that sort of goes beyond the context of looking at a single file of text. So that, I'd say, is the for the editor windows. One very nice feature is the integration between the editor windows and the shell window. At any time when you're editing a file, you can hit F5 and run the code in that file in the shell and see the output there, interact with it if it's in, asks for user input and so on. And then once that's done running, you still have the namespace populated by that file, so you can inspect variables and classes and sort of check everything that happened and continue working interactively after that's run. So it's a very nice environment for iterating quickly, just testing simple things out. And when you're learning, that's one of the reasons it's very nice for learning Python. You can enter some code, hit F5, see what happens, go back to the code, try fix what you've done or try something else, and so on. And then the shell window has some really nice features like very nice auto completion, call tips, It has we recently added a feature where it squeezes very long outputs so they don't sort of fill up your shell indefinitely. It squeezes them into this small bar that you can expand or view in a separate window. You can restart the shell. You can restart the separate Python process which actually runs the commands so without losing all of your previous output. And it has many other features. I won't go into all of them, but just to give a taste, it's a pretty nice interactive environment. And that's really the reason why I started to use IDLE. Back when I was in the military, we would use IDLE for a lot of our interactive work. After in the beginning, we were using just simple command line interactive interface. And IDLE was much better than that. And that's actually what led me to begin contributing to IDLE. When I was in the military, we extended IDLE's capabilities mostly in the shell to make our interactive work more effective. And then I wanted to bring some of those improvements back to Python's IDLE.
And so that's a good entry point to discuss some of your overall experience of working as a core contributor and some of the involvement that you've had with IDLE specifically over the years. So I'm wondering if you can maybe talk through some of the challenges that exist in the implementation of IDLE as far as adding new capabilities, and maybe discuss a bit about how IDLE itself has actually implemented and architected and some of the evolutions and changes that have happened up to the point where you got involved and then through to today.
So IDLE is built on TCL/TK, which is a GUI toolkit, which actually runs the TCL language underneath the hood. This is all done by the tkinter module in the Python standard library. IDLE builds on that and uses that as its GUI toolkit very extensively. That influences a lot of the technical, sort of the way IDLE is built. So this was originally started in 98 by Guido, and it's developed a lot since then. The code base shows that. I mean, it's when any code base that has been developing continuously for 20 years shows its age. And Python has also developed a lot over those years. I mean, it started before Python 2. So that's definitely, it's been undergoing a lot of maintenance and updating in the recent years, but that's a lot of work. Terry J. Reedy has been doing a really great job, just tirelessly working to bring the code up to date in the recent few years. So it's in a pretty good state now. It's well tested mostly, and now most of the changes are we're writing things that are just for Python 3, since the Python 2 version doesn't need to be maintained any longer, with the Python 2 sunset a couple of weeks from now. So the implementation, it has an RPC mechanism for the main GUI process to talk the sub process that actually runs the shell commands. I'm trying to think what I can say about the architecture itself. So as far as architecture, it's pretty simple. IDLE is built. Mostly there's a central editor window class from which the shell window is actually a subclass, and a few other types of windows like output windows for search results and so on. And those classes pull in a bunch of modules which are pretty independent, and they connect them together. So every major feature of IDLE, such as auto completion, call tips, code context, search and replace, all of those are implemented in standalone modules, which the editor window or the different windows pull in and tie together. That's like the overarching architecture. And the other part of that architecture is really the RPC mechanism by which the shell communicates with the Python subprocess for running commands. It actually acts as a server talking with a client, a two-way RPC mechanism, so that both the GUI can interrupt, for example, the GUI can interrupt the subprocess if I hit Control-C or if I'm closing IDLE. And the other way as well, I can get output or exceptions from commands run in the shell. So those are the two major parts of the sort of high-level design of IDLE. And there is an extension mechanism. And originally, many of these features were written as extensions, but we've been pulling all of those extensions in as actual modules of IDLE, and removing them from the extension from being written as extensions, just so they could be better tested and better integrated and avoid some funny quirks that arose from the extension API. So these days there aren't any extensions that are shipped with idle by default. There used to be quite a few, but you can still add other extensions. There aren't many. I mean, the hope that there would become an ecosystem of idle extensions never really panned out. There are a few sort of projects like IdleX or VPython that were more forks of idle than just a set of extensions, and they implemented various features as extensions, but you don't see people pulling in just one or several key extensions into their idle for daily use. That's almost never happens. Part of that is because just technically the extension interface isn't very user friendly. There's no easy way to install an extension. You need to download the code and actually copy it into the library where your idle is, and then copy a specific part of the configuration text into your configuration files for idles. That's not a nice interface. That doesn't really make it trivial. And there were some thoughts of making that easier, but there was lack of interest. I think that's why that never actually happened.
And so, as you mentioned, the code for idle was started about 20 years ago, and now we're to the point where we're sunsetting Python 2 support. And so I'm curious how well the overall code in the idle module has aged as new capabilities and features in the language itself have been added, and as the sort of programming paradigms and GUI toolkits have evolved. And so I'm curious what the sort of pain points have been as far as keeping things up to date and keeping them runnable, or sort of how well it has held up, and then maybe some of the plans that are in store for the future of idle now that we can free ourselves from Python 2 and start to look forward to how it looks in a Python 3 only world.
So the code base itself is in the process of being brought more up to date. It's still backwards compatible with Python 2, but with that being sunsetted in a couple of weeks, we'll stop doing that. And actually, many of the recent improvements and changes are no longer in the Python 2 branch, and they were written so they're not no longer compatible with Python 2. And going forward, we'll be removing a lot of those backwards compatibility parts of the code base and make it more easier to maintain and easier to read. Overall, there's been a lot of work to update the code base, so it's in pretty good shape. Really, the hardest part of keeping idle in good working shape has been the evolution of operating systems, and trying to keep things working as they are is actually rather difficult. Part of that is because it's built on top of TCL/TK, and that project has had a difficult few years where it wasn't very well kept up to date, and it had all sorts of problems. I mean, on Mac OS especially, or back in the years when it was called OS X, there were all sorts of problems there that we had to work around, or sometimes we just couldn't fix in idle because they were just issues in TCL/TK itself. Sometimes we had, at one point, Python began shipping a specific version of TCL/TK with its OS X or Mac OS installers, just to ensure that a good version, because the version that Apple shipped was problematic, and the latest version that you could install from source was problematic. So we began shipping our own known to be good version of TCL/TK not just for idle to work, but everything based on TK Inter to actually keep working well. And we're still not in a great situation as far as that goes. I mean, the recent Mac OS release caused a few more things to break. Our support for the new dark mode of Mac OS isn't great yet, just to give two examples. And also, there are all sorts of bugs in idle that we're having problems keeping up and fixing all of them, and doing so on all the different platforms. Also because just interest in idle and maintaining and developing it, as it hasn't been very high. In the past, I'd say a year or two, Terry J. Reedy and I have been doing a lot of that work. So I think it's a bit better than it was before, but there's still a lot of room for improvement. So if anyone hearing this now would like to help, I would be delighted to help anyone who would be interested to work on idle, to guide and help you find interesting things to do, and to together to fix bugs or to move it forward and improve it.
And I believe that there have actually been a few projects that have tried to build more full-featured editors on top of idle and using that as a base. I'm curious curious what you have seen as far as any projects along those lines or other interesting or innovative use cases that it's been leveraged for.
So I'm aware of one such project that really added quite a few features, and that's IDLEX, but I don't see that that's really taken off or seen wide use. I'm not aware of other major projects that try to build a more fully featured IDE on top of that. There are some projects that try to use IDLE for more specific education or learning environments. I think VPython, which also has I think VPython also has a version of IDLE with various changes that's supposed to be used for robotics, for controlling robots in an educational context. But I'm not updated on where that project is today. It was started a long time ago. And there is some integration with IDLE with a Python Turtle module, which is also to be intended for use to learn programming in a more child-friendly way or more visual way. But actually, there haven't been many significant projects that I'm aware of, at least, that have done so, unfortunately. Part of that is probably because the codebase is not the easiest to build upon and to use.
And so, as we've mentioned a couple of times, IDLE is often used in a learning or a beginning coder environment. And as you said, there's the integration with the Turtle module. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are or your impressions as far as the impacts and benefits in terms of the adoption and growth of Python that IDLE has played, and the fact that there is this environment that makes it possible to have an easy to get started and easy to learn environment so that you don't have to install a whole bunch of different things to get started using Python.
So I think it was more pronounced in the early years, back in the 2000s, when installing many languages, you would need to install something like Visual Studio or big IDE or install a build tool chain. And in contrast to that, once you had Python installed, which was relatively easy usually, or many systems had it pre-installed, you could just get started. Similar to other what were called scripting languages like Perl, for example, that were just there. You could always use them. It was very easy to pick them up and just start get going. And on the other hand, those were scripting languages were usually just written in editors. Python having a GUI IDE, I think, did make things much easier for beginners than opening VI or Emacs just in comparison. I think these days with the VS Code and Sublime Text and many other powerful and widely available editors. And for Python, for example, PyCharm is very widespread, but there are other great editors and IDEs out there. I'm just not going to name them all because there's so many. I think the importance of IDLE in that has become reduced. Also, in terms of an interactive environment, I think at the time, IDLE's shell. At the time, IDLE's shell was really the only alternative to just running Python in a command line for an interactive environment. But these days we have IPython and Jupyter and a few others as well that are really very, very good interactive environments with a lot of features. So I think IDLE's shell has become much less used in recent years, just due to the widespread availability of great other tools.
Yeah, I think that the introduction of Jupyter as a new environment for getting people started to code has started to consume some of the use case for IDLE, where it's definitely a little bit more complicated to get running on a local machine, but the fact that there are these web-based environments for being able to experiment with the notebooks and incorporate the visual outputs of things like charts and graphs maybe is starting to subsume the user base for IDLE. But for local development, I think it's definitely still has a lot of value for people to be able to just install Python, run a single command, and then have that editor running without having to think about, well, what editor do I want to use, and how do I get it configured, and how do I get it running with Python?
Absolutely. With more and more everything happening on the web or in a browser these days, so IDLE obviously becomes less popular in this context. I still think, I mean, one of the strong points of Python compared to practically any language is that you can fire up the interactive command line or interactive shell and just, type help something and see, or just try anything out immediately. You don't need to compile it. You don't, and that's also one of the nice things about JavaScript. You just open a browser, open the console and type something and see what happens. In most other languages, that's much more complicated to just try something out and see what works. And that's when I teach Python, I try to deflect as many questions as possible with, well, just try it. IDLE is a great environment for that, just because everything being more graphic and more easier to understand, the colored output and the ability to restart the shell without losing your history. It has a lot of nice features for just playing around and seeing everything.
Are there any other aspects of your work on the IDLE project or your experience as a core contributor or the IDLE module specifically that we didn't discuss yet that you'd like to cover before we close out the show?
Sure. So, I mentioned that I began contributing to IDLE when I wanted to sort of help contribute back some of the nice features we developed for IDLE. And that took a long time. That was sort of my first steps with contributing to open source. This was much before GitHub or Git. This was before Python even used Mercurial. It was back on SVN with you needed to post patches to the issue tracker and wait for something to review them. We didn't even have code review tools. So people would manually apply the patches, try them locally, review them, and then just give, write back on the issue tracker with comments. That process took a long time. And also I had no previous experience contributing to open source, and this wasn't something that was nearly as common as it is today outside of certain circles like Linux development. So it took a while to understand. At the time, Kurt B. Kaiser was leading the development of IDLE, and it took a while for me to understand his vision for IDLE to keep things simple, to cater to novice users rather than power users. So many of the features that I wanted to contribute were, declined, or we had to pare them down or change them to make them simpler or more easily discoverable or more newbie friendly before they came in. And it took many years, but eventually some of those things like improvements to the auto completion or the automatic squeezing of previous outputs and several other things did make it in. And there are still some such features that haven't gotten in yet. I mean, I've been working for years on a search bar. IDLE still uses a very old-fashioned search, like a fine dialogue like you have in Notepad. Almost any editing environment these days has a search bar. I think even Word today uses a search bar by default rather than opening a dialogue on top of your window. Definitely every IDE I know does this. But in IDLE, you still get this huge dialogue, which is very clunky. But sort of getting this working, testing it on all the different platforms, dealing with all the different edge cases is a lot of work. And just getting someone to review and go through the whole process, it takes a long time. And I think for IDLE more so than other parts of Python, simply because so few core developers work on it, and so few people in general. So that's sort of one aspect that I think is worth highlighting. Another thing I hadn't mentioned was that in 2004, we had a Google Summer of Code student take part in the Python projects and work specifically on IDLE. His name is, I'm probably mispronouncing this, I'm sorry, Simon Hav Heblikar. So he worked through the summer and I co-mentored him with Terry Reedy. Terry actually did most of the mentoring. I helped here and there. And he did a lot of work, adding tests mostly I think was a big part of his work. But also he did most of the initial work on writing the line numbers feature and many other features as well. So he did quite a bit. And I have to mention my friend, my good friend Noam Rafael, with whom I served in the military, and he wrote the code context feature and the call tips feature. And I think he was either he wrote the auto completion feature or he added a lot to it.
All right. Well, for anybody who wants to get in touch with you or follow along with the work that you're doing or get involved with IDLE development, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And so with that, I'll move us into the picks. And this week I'm going to choose the show Mr. Robot. I started watching that recently and have been working my way through the episodes, and it's a very good storyline, a lot of interesting character development, and they actually do a pretty good job of staying fairly accurate on the technical pieces. So it's always good to see that level of detail in a show, because a lot of times they'll just throw the sort of usual hacker trope of just banging away on the keyboard and having everything start working magically. So it's interesting to see a lot of the social engineering aspects that they bring into the show to try and popularize the way that technology actually works. And so with that, I'll pass it to you, Tal. Do you have any picks this week?
Yeah, I have a couple, and as I work in educational technology, they'll be sort of educational, they'll be sort of education related, but they're nice and popular things. So the first one would be the movie Captain Fantastic, which sounds like a superhero movie, but it isn't really. I just won't spoil anything. If you're at all interested in education of children, then it's a must watch, in my opinion. And it sort of causes a lot of opinionated responses from people. But at the very least, it's thought-provoking and interesting. And then my second pick is Paul Graham of Y Combinator fame. Recently posted a blog post about hackable tests, which I found I connected to very much, and I think gives sort of ties in a lot to how almost all of our education systems are built and how they work. So I recommend reading that.
All right. Well, thank you very much for taking the time today to join me and discuss your experience of working on IDLE and some of the history of that venerable module. So I appreciate all of the work that you've done, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you too, Tobias. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to check out our other show, the Data Engineering Podcast, at dataengineeringpodcast.com for the latest on modern data management. And visit the site at pythonpodcasts.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. And if you've learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts@podcastinit.com with your story. To help other people find the show, please leave a review on iTunes and tell your friends and coworkers.